Here's the latest game in the Fabiano Caruana Top 10 Attacks playlist. I wanted to bring things right up to date, so I'm including two games from the Batumi Olympiad. There's the game that Fabiano played against Shahriar Mamedyarov. I've already recorded that and I've added that to the playlist. I think that was just a sensational game. Fabiano showed superb technique, and the way he hounded the king was wonderful, and you can see that game if you click on the link there. And this game was played a couple of rounds before in the match between Bosnia-Herzegovina and the United States. So Fabiano's opponent here is Denis Kadric, who's rated 2543. So you can't say that this guy is weak. He's a strong player, but very interesting to see how Fabiano changes his game to tackle a slightly weaker player. So for a start, he's playing the Sicilian, and his opponent is, well, playing knight c3. Does he want to play a Grand Prix attack or a close Sicilian? Well, actually, this was just a little move order finesse, and instead he goes back into an open Sicilian, and it's a Khan variation. That's with e6 and a6, that is. And this is a very flexible system, and even the next move, queen c7, maintains flexibility in black's position. That queen looks down this diagonal and this line, but black hasn't committed the d pawn yet. I think that's crucial. Nor the b pawn, nor his pieces either. And let's see how Fabiano exploits that really nicely. I mean, obviously white has a very wide range of moves here. Bishop e3, bishop e2, g3 also possible, but bishop d3 played. And here's the moment where Fabiano plays something a little bit tricky, because he hasn't moved his e pawn yet. D pawn. Then this diagonal is open. So just watch what happens. First knight f6, and then bishop c5. So what he's doing with this move is he's knocking that knight out of the way. So it spins back, obviously wants to take the bishop, and now the bishop goes back to a7. So two things. One, the knight has been pushed to a square which is less active than in the middle, and this bishop finds itself on rather a wonderful diagonal. King h1 played, but of course to some extent black has lost a bit of time in doing this, so time to catch up with development. So we have a shavening in the structure, but this bishop is in a slightly unusual position on a7, obviously much more active, and this determines strategy. And now Fabiano really goes for it. Of course, it's still possible to castle kingside, but actually he wants to use the fact that this bishop is more actively placed, and he plays h5. This is actually a very common idea in various Sicilian systems. And here, in combination with the bishop, we would very much like to play knight g4. And it would be hard to drive this knight away with h3, because obviously that couldn't be taken, because it leads to some kind of checkmate here on the h file. So we have our usual dilemma that white has. How far do you allow that pawn to go? Well, I mean, I think blockading with h4 looks absolutely terrible because it gives the knight a beautiful square. We're not going to do that. But do you allow it to run here, or do you play h3? The problem with h3, apart from the fact that, I mean, knight g4 is still possible, but actually black can play here and then come into g3, also very unpleasant. So white decides, I think very sensibly, to play bishop e3 to exchange off that dangerous bishop. Now Fabiano plays bishop d7, and he's ready take his king to the other side of the board. Having played h5, that would be sensible. It's an interesting position because I think it's easier for black to play than white here. White doesn't know what he wants to do with those central pawns. If this one is pushed forward, then the knight comes here and the e-pawn is lost. If you play f5, then that gives the knight here a square, although it could be that white can use that one. Maybe it's more sensible to play the knight in from f6 to g4 and then e5. So, you know, there are positional disadvantages in playing like that. So what does white do? Well, in the game, white decided to plant the knight in on b6, which at first glance looks pretty nice, but actually the problem is it can't be followed up very well. If white wants to kind of calm things down a bit, you could trade queens. But I think e5 is a good move actually, because those knights don't look very good now. In any case, knight b6 played, and now the bishop just drops back to e8. This reminds me of the famous expression, which I'm not quite sure who first said it actually, but Soviet player Eduard Gufeld was famous for saying it. He says, even the worst bishop in the world is better than the best knight. And you could say that sort of applies to this position, because the knight does look pretty good on b6. In fact, you can't use it, and it, in some ways is a bit of a liability. And that bishop, which doesn't look great, splits the rooks and doesn't have many prospects at the moment. Well, that has quite a future ahead of it. Let's see what happens. So c4, fine. Gives white a little bit more control in the centre. Although I have to say, perhaps it might be worth, if we're going to play the knight to b6, it might be worth cementing it there with a4, a5. Anyway, c4. h4, white's dilemma again. If you blockade the pawn and the knight comes in to g3, which looks attractive. So white decides to leave the h-pawn, but this looks very pleasant already. I mean, white doesn't want to take and give black something to attack on the h-file, so he closes it, but just watch that diagonal. This is very dangerous, and this basically determines black's strategy over the next, well, till the end of the game actually. Black is attacking the king. So that hits the queen. The queen comes back. And now f5. Very logical move. We want to break open this diagonal and give checkmate. Perhaps not that diagonal, but maybe this diagonal. There we go. I misfired again. So if pawn takes pawn, then it's easy to see how black can exploit this. Knight hits this, and boom, the bishop hits the diagonal, and the queen will follow up afterwards. Looks extremely painful. So coming back here, f5 just played. Bishop e2. And the knight comes back to e7, just making room for the bishop to come up the board. So if bishop takes, just pawn takes, and actually that bishop could either come to c6 or possibly g6, and there's still the chance to break open the position with g5, so that would be not a problem. Once that light squared bishop goes, the king is in trouble. So white decides to play knight a5, so that if that bishop hits c6, at least it can be exchanged off. I mean, now there are several ways for black to play. Knight f6 just keeps the pressure on the central squares in the diagonal and removes the knight. That's certainly not a bad move, but Fabiano's next move was very interesting, a very pragmatic move actually. He played queen c5. Now you might think, well, hang on, what's he doing exchanging queens when he wants to attack? But actually, the attack does not diminish in any way after this move. And also, white's knights are a little bit vulnerable. So given the knights are attacked, then really white has to exchange. And you can see that this knight can be pushed out very easily by a king move. And then the next knight driven away, and then the bishop will hit the diagonal. So white is still in some trouble. It's not quite checkmate. The king has a square, but just watch what happens. Bishop takes knight. Well, that knight was threatening to come in on e3 in some cases, and also rook d2 happening. So it's important for white to challenge the d file. But now that bishop emerges into the daylight, a new dawn, attacking the pawn here. Well, there's a nice variation. If white is highly materialistic and wants to keep that pawn with, let's say, e5, then you can see how quickly white's position collapses. First a check, then we drive the knight away. The knight retreats. We take, and there's no need to drive the other knight away, just bishop c2 wins material. Loose pieces drop off. So after bishop g6, basically white is in trouble. I mean, maybe the best idea is to bring the knight from that slightly vulnerable position and just give up a pawn and at least centralize the piece. Black is obviously better, he's a pawn up, but still, it's a thought. But anyway, rook d7 played instead, which kind of looks dangerous. I mean, look at white's pieces. In fact, they're doing nothing at all, because after bishop takes pawn check, that bishop protects the pawn on b7, and then white goes nowhere. Knight f5, great square, looking at some really important points, and watch out for that sacrifice. Well, it's hardly a sacrifice when the h-pawn steams through. Rook here. This isn't quite possible yet because we can still deflect that rook, but it's coming soon. So this bishop anchors itself on a beautiful square. White's in trouble. Yes, white at least takes this pawn back, but the problem is that this opens lines. Black only needs to bring a rook down to hassle the king and, you know, maybe get at the h-pawn, and the game is over. And that's basically what happens. King a7 is a very calm move. So it's looking at this knight here. And, well, let's say this knight comes back to b3 to take on c5. And then this move is an absolute killer. After the exchange, well, let's play the move. Then this knight is on prise. And then the rook comes down. And it's basically game over. Yeah. And with the knight and bishop, it's deadly. If it's not mate, then the h-pawn is dropping, and it's game over. King a7 just played. White played rook c7. I mean, this is hopeless, but by this stage it's lost anyway. The rook came down, check. Another check. The king can't step up, has to stay on the back rank. And rook takes h2. The h-pawn comes good. b4 is a bit of forlorn hope. It's obviously lost now. And just one last thing after knight a5. And rook b7 check is threatened, but no problem. We can just remove the knight, and here Kadric resigned. Obviously, if the rook is taken, then this one rolls home. I like the kind of the consistency of Caruana's play here. Basically, from the time that he played h5, his strategy was, well, you could say, pretty much one note in a way. You know, he's playing for the king and he's using that h-pawn. But nevertheless, I really like that game. And interesting seeing him play like that. Very, very aggressively, actually. But but I think also very soundly too. So that concludes the top 10 attacks playlist. I've added other videos that I've recorded from previous years in previous tournaments. But do check out the whole playlist. You'll find the link up there. Tell me which is your favourite. But also, I want to balance things up. We've got the World Championship match just a few weeks away in London. Starts on November the 9th. And there's also a Magnus playlist that I recorded last year with his top 10 finishes. So do check that out as well. Thanks very much for watching.